Can you beat Nth Radius 2 0.14 stuck at security level 0? In theory yes, so I tried it. During the run I could only buy the most basic items in the shop, limited myself to only using portals required for missions, and couldn't collect items from leveling up. Obviously I needed the hardest preset difficulty, and I turned on Iron Man to avoid abusing save files. Let the pain begin. First I completed the tutorial and entered the UNPSC facility to claim my starting items. I accepted the first mission, Explore Probation, which was a short extraction mission to pick up an outdated sensor. Next, I entered the peninsula, the first area in the Proficiency Anomaly, and quickly located the item I was sent to get. There was some ash nearby, which converts to credits in the store, and a couple of shotgun shells and altered items. I didn't encounter any enemies, so I got back to the facility after only a few minutes. I immediately handed in the sensor, which earned me a fair 600 credits and a box of crackers. The next mission was Proficiency Test, which forced me to go much deeper into the peninsula and bring back a special artifact. Unlike last time, I stayed off the beaten path. I knew if I took a somewhat unconventional route, I'd have better cover from mimics, but I somehow still managed to lose nearly half my health to the easiest mimic in the game. Fantastic. On the way to collecting the artifact, I came across one more enemy, a fragment, and I eventually found the glass jar which housed my objective. On the way back, I took a detour to another anomaly cluster where I found a second artifact, as well as an altered item and some ash. Back at the facility, I brought the required artifact straight to the command room. I got a solid 1,000 credits, the next main quest, 2 side quests, and my security level got raised to 1. At level 1, you're supposed to receive this shotgun for free, so I threw it away. Correction, I recycled it, and probably saved at least 2 or 3 virtual Siberian brown bears. Anyway, in the shop, you're also supposed to get access to better firearms and useful accessories, but I didn't get any of that. Instead, I spent a few minutes rearranging my chest rig, organizing my backpack and loot, healing up, and buying more of the same basic supplies. Once I felt prepared, I went out to the forest to complete my third top priority mission, Fluctuating Signal. Here, I needed to locate 3 sensors, each one getting deeper into enemy territory than the last. My first enemy encounter in the forest was against 2 spawns. The first one I took out after taking a hit, and the second I spammed out of existence before it pounced. Normally spawns can be easily one-shot with a shotgun, but I didn't have a shotgun. I had a Makarov, which deals approximately 0 damage per bullet. I also managed to drop 2 of my magazines and a box of crackers during the short skirmish, an average of 1.5 things dropped per enemy. While I was reloading my first magazine, an environmental noise that sounded awfully similar to a fragment started getting louder. I snapped into reality about a half second before getting attacked, and I moved backward fast enough to avoid taking any damage. Another fragment followed behind, which managed to dodge a couple bullets with its janky movement, but ultimately succumbed to the power of the PM. With no enemies in sight, I snuck as fast as I could towards the first sensor. Fortunately, I had an artifact side mission in the same location. Unfortunately, it was getting extremely dark. My pocket flashlight attached to my chest rig was enough to avoid running into anomalies, but it still meant I had a huge disadvantage in a fight. In any case, the first sensor only took a small amount of careful maneuvering to get to, and I collected the 2 artifacts I needed just as easily. My next stop was to grab a stashed shotgun nearby, which conveniently fit inside my backpack since it didn't have a handguard. The ammo it came with was a welcome bonus, even though the shotgun itself wouldn't be useful yet with no spot to grab with a second hand. Back to the mission, the next sensor I needed to find led me to a floating house. Here I panicked and missed every shot on a police mimic, then proceeded to get flanked by a fragment and scout mimic. From this one interaction, it was clear I was completely unprepared and had very slim chances of surviving my way up to the second sensor. After getting my butt handed to me a total of 4 times, I went back to the facility. I figured I'd finish some side missions first to get more resources and supplies, and come back during the day. Once I arrived, I completed the artifact side mission, rearranged my chest rig to give some room between the magazines, practiced some mag palming, and organized my loot. While doing so, I started thinking about how I'd be able to bring back and use large stashed firearms during the run. Normally, I'd buy a primary holster, but in the shop, it's locked behind security level 2. That is, until I realized the primary holster was a part of the chest rig bundle, which was available at security level 0. After testing my theory on a separate profile, I discovered that you can use this trick to get the primary holster early. Next, I finished a few side missions in the peninsula where I found a stashed GSH-18. Most of its stats were identical to the PM I was already using, but the magazine capacity was a reasonable 18 instead of just 8. With my newfound surplus of credits, I decided to add a holster to carry both pistols at once. Now with only a few hours left before the first tide, where enemies and most loot would reset, I carefully planned a route to tackle the top mission and 2 nearby side missions together. I'd go to grab the artifacts on the left first, complete the sample delivery during the night, and finish with the top mission at the floating house. Once the tide had struck, I went straight into the forest to make use of the last bit of light left. The artifacts for the first side mission I collected easily, but now everything was shrouded in darkness. In a moment of foolishness, I went back to the floating house to complete the next step in the top mission. After multiple valiant and unsuccessful attempts, I finally succumbed succumb to my original plan. This allowed me to attack the enemies near the floating house with daylight in a better position. While I didn't survive on my first attempt, it didn't take long before I took out all the enemies in the area from behind a convenient rock. After the battle, I found the second sensor and thoroughly looted the area. There were also 2 standard syringes, many altered items, and I even found a stashed shotgun. Because the shotgun had the stashed attribute, I moved the handguard onto my previous, slightly superior shotgun. I still had the final part of the third top mission to go, but with the ability to put 2 hands on my shotgun, anything was possible. After a few preparations, I ran to the top left corner of the forest to find the last sensor. I took out 2 police mimics without taking any damage, and sniped 2 mimics up on the trains. For whatever reason, everything went very smoothly, and after some thorough looting, I went back with the sensor and a stashed SKS in hand. Back at the facility, I got 1200 credits in exchange for the sensor, as well as oil and a brush to throw away. I also received the 4th top priority mission, Thinking in Anomalies, which required me to go back near the train station. This was fortunate since I'd already cleared out most of the enemies along the paths to get there, though like the last top mission, I knew there'd be multiple parts. I also got a couple more side missions to do in the peninsula, along with a generic altered item search. I've been saving up my altered items for just an occasion, and was able to instantly complete multiple item searches. Looking at the timer before the tide, there was only a day and 6 hours left, so I opted to go to the peninsula where I made no progress. Each time I took out the police mimic up on this ledge, it alerted all the mimics in the area. I couldn't handle them all at once during the night. I was a little annoyed that after all my improvement, I still couldn't survive in the peninsula easily, but I buried my concerns by loading back into the forest. Slightly over a day was plenty of time if I stayed in areas where I'd already taken out enemies, but I wasn't sure how much Thinking in Anomalies had changed in the recent 0.14 update. Entering the forest, I was attacked from both sides by 2 waiting police mimics. I spotted them quickly and killed them both without taking much damage, and made my way to the first portal. It's important to clarify that I can only use a portal if it's essential to the run, so when I accidentally triggered the second portal while looting near the first, that meant that I'd just automatically signed up to finding any glitches possible to get past future portals. Unfortunately, I didn't run into the same bug at the second portal near the floating house. I tried moving around it and even tried throwing stuff inside, but nothing was triggering the third portal. I spent a few minutes going back and forth, even under the portal, doing any desperate random thing I could think of. Eventually, I tried throwing in a single bullet, which for whatever reason worked. I made it to the third portal with little issue and threw in a round of ammo. Of course, this time did absolutely nothing, and I didn't have the ability to dance around the portal waiting. I couldn't get much closer without jumping down, so instead I tried throwing a bullet in while holding my map in the other hand. Logical. With a few hours left till dawn, I snuck toward the church and near the center of the forest. There were many buildings to get past, so I expected at least a few enemies lurking about, so when I heard the first mimic voice line, I bolted to the nearest house with an open entry. This was one of the worst houses I could have entered, since there was only one exit, no upstairs, and no good angle to attack without taking heavy damage. I had over a day left on the clock, so in hindsight I could have waited a few hours till morning. Instead, I tried an even worse building, which had terribly placed tires that didn't allow me to hug the only safe wall. After a few failed attempts, I went back to procrastinating with side missions in the peninsula. Since I didn't kill any of the enemies near the church, I wouldn't be losing much progress, and I wasn't convinced that one day would be enough to finish the job anyway. This time in the peninsula, I brought the fury of my explorer intuition and took out the first 3 police mimics in a fragment fluently. I was finally hitting most of my shots, and my mag palming felt natural. With my confidence rising, I kept pushing forward, and as you might expect, I got humbled fast. I also had time to finish an equipment maintenance mission in the forest, which gave me access to another item search. This time I didn't have one of the rare altered items, but I'd likely find it on the way to the church. I then slept till morning and set out to finish my most difficult mission yet. Almost right away, I had a messy encounter with 2 police mimics. Eventually, I made it quite a bit further, even finding the sensor for an equipment maintenance mission, but instead of grabbing it and getting out of there, I foolishly danced around in circles with the spawn, alerting every entity in the area. I prepared for a drawn-out combat behind a nearby shed, took out a couple phantoms before getting annihilated by 2 scout mimics. On my next try, I mixed up the game plan by hiding inside the shed. Phantoms couldn't come in, which allowed me to stay focused on the mimics, and I also brought out my shotgun and had this nice interaction with a hunter and scout. I rarely got to use the shotgun because of my limited ammo, which made it all the more satisfying when I utilized it perfectly. I eventually took out the rest of the phantoms and mimics that followed me to the shed, and I edged along this slope to avoid most enemies on my way to the church. Once I got closer, I had one of the messiest fragment interactions I've ever witnessed firsthand. ground. I was on the edge of a very steep slope, which made the fragments pathing unpredictable. They stopped and changed direction on a dime, leading me to panic and miss a couple rounds with my shotgun. Not only that, but when I tried putting my shotgun ammo away, I dropped it and it rolled into the water. Since I was getting targeted by a hunter, I chose to come back for it later, but I never was able to retrieve it. That was basically all the shotgun ammo I had at the time, which meant that the close quarters combat coming up in the recreation base was going to be brutal. In any case, I made it to the church. I was tasked to find 3 unique artifacts, but the maze of portals that led to portals that led to more portals was confusing and took me longer than expected. I also took crazy damage from an annoying hunter mimic, which must have pulled out its heat-seeking rounds because it didn't miss from any angle. On my way back, I looted the area until my storage was nearly full and got back to base without any issue. Times like this, I wished for an expedition backpack, which allowed double the storage space, but alas, there's not much equipment I could buy stuck at security level 0. After the long journey, I finally finished thinking in Anomalies and was upgraded to security level 2. Of course, that meant nothing except receiving an advanced artifact detector I couldn't use, and a much harder mission that would push me to my limits. It's important to mention that I brought the advanced artifact detector with me in case it was essential to progress, but I never ended up using it. Now it's time to start the new mission to 0.14, Extract the Case. I knew the recreation-based mission was coming eventually, but I felt unprepared after just losing most of my shotgun ammo. With the day and 13 hours before the tide, it wasn't worth attempting Extract the Case now, so I finished some simple side missions and ran the clock down to 18 hours. Everything left was either deep into dangerous territory or acquired the advanced artifact detector I couldn't use. After another round of preparation and organization, I slept before tackling my hardest mission yet. On entering the forest, I took a sharp right to avoid as many enemies as I could, and I eventually made it to arguably the most difficult bridge to cross in the game. There's always at least a couple scout mimics nearby, and they're difficult to track since they constantly reposition behind the many obstacles. I spent nearly all the daylight I had left clearing out the mimics around the bridge, and afterward I scavenged the area, keeping my eye out for shotgun ammo. Once I finally crossed the bridge, it was very dark, so I didn't see the hunter mimic who two-tapped me until it was too late. That's the beauty of not having any armor. When I respawned, I spent much less time looting near the bridge. Instead, I used every ounce of daylight to travel to the recreation base unscathed. Right away, I had a messy encounter with the police mimic and got annihilated by a scout. For my last autosave at the bridge, I chose to head back and sleep through the night. There were too many enemies near the recreation base for me to handle at dark, and with 2 days before the next tide, losing a few hours didn't concern me. Quickly making it back to the recreation base, I drew out each enemy patiently and took out the first few without an issue. I ended up dying because I didn't realize reflector anomalies reflected bullets back at you in 0.14, but I got back to where I was and eventually drew out the 2 scout mimics. The cover was mediocre and I took a lot of damage, but I managed to stay alive long enough to take them both out. Next, I moved to the exact location shown on the map, which I assumed would then quickly lead me to the building's entrance. No, that would have been too easy. Instead, part 2 of Extract the Case was finding a sensor deeper into dangerous enemy territory. Funny enough, my brain didn't register it right away. I was so convinced I'd immediately get into the recreation base that my subconscious was hiding the truth from me. In any case, I was still conscious enough to realize I was getting low on supplies and made a short trip back to the facility to restock. I lost a lot of daylight, thinking daylight wasn't important inside the recreation base, and I also lost plenty of precious time before the tide. And if I failed, I'd be forced to clear out the same massive area of the forest again, but this time with extremely limited resources. Once I finally got back to the recreation base, entered a nearby building to loot and protect myself from the mimics on the roof, I had an interesting encounter with a spawned phantom and a recovering fragment, but I managed to stay alive. This is when I noticed that the next part of the mission wasn't simply jumping into a portal to get inside the recreation base. No, with 1 day 8 hours left before the tide, only a few hours before night, unprotected, and with limited supplies, I would need to draw out every explorer's greatest superpower, their utter desperation. Strategically, I paused the game to think without wasting in-game time. Absolutely terrified I wouldn't finish before the tide hit, I made a beeline for the first sensor. I took out a few enemies on the way there, though I was surprised to not get swarmed yet. My suspicions did come true on my way to the second sensor, where I got ambushed by a pair of scout mimics. On my next attempt, I moved toward my objective a bit more carefully. In fact, since night was fast approaching, I was having no luck finding the second sensor. I chose to bunker down in a 2-story house to clear the area from safety. My plan worked, sort of. Enemies were constantly repositioning, trying to find an angle to shoot me, and I was desperately unloading as much ammo as I could while there was still light. Got a few good kills, but I was taking loads of damage and running out of time. At a certain point, I could basically only see enemies once they fired, though my light held up to the window let me see anything close. Using said light was definitely better than nothing, but with only one hand on my pistol, I had a slim chance of hitting my target. Eventually, I moved the room over to the left, noticing a window window without any bars in the way. This was another small improvement, but I was making progress very slowly, which wasn't an option with my very limited time and ammo. I figured I'd try moving to the lower floor, so I dropped outside and found my way through the front entrance. A police medic was waiting inside, and a spawn and 2 fragments came in behind me. After these interactions, I was now down to about 40 9x18 ammo and 10 shotgun ammo, besides any in my magazines. Not only did I need to find at least one more sensor, but I had the entire recreation base to get through too. After a few very long minutes, I managed to find the second sensor. Thankfully, that was all I needed to unlock the portal, which was nearby. On my way there, I had a messy encounter with 3 spawns, even prompting me to retreat to a random house. Now I had nearly 0 ammo left. Eventually, I was able to find the floating masses of land which spiraled up to the portal. Waiting at the top was an SKS, which I couldn't collect without giving up my shotgun, so I left it and jumped inside. I was teleported to the top of the recreation base with an easy entry point beside me. From earlier, I knew there were many enemies on the roof, so to avoid them, I jumped into the building and was killed the moment I hit the ground. After finding my way back to the portal, I felt much more prepared for attempt number 2. I knew where I'd get teleported, I knew how to get inside the recreation base, and I knew where the first enemy was waiting. Yeah, none of that mattered. The first Scout Mimic just shielded himself inside a wall, and when trying to seek protection in a room, another Scout Mimic ate me up. I respawned and entered a third time. Here I planned to be more careful entering random rooms. However, the locations of the Mimics were now slightly different, which is a welcome surprise. There was no Scout Mimic waiting in the hall anymore, so I dropped down and entered the first room on the left like before. I expected a swarm of enemies to enter at any moment, but the only Mimic that stayed in the hallway for long was extremely stuck in a wall. I made my way to the first room on the right, making a small step forward. After a moment, I tried taking out a Stormtrooper Mimic that entered the hallway, who randomly noticed me and sent me to the death screen in less than a second. Awesome. On my next attempt, I made it to the third room easily, and even found a round of shotgun ammo. In the fourth room, I didn't see any mimics right away, but got quite the jump scare by a hunter mimic waiting around the corner. On the shelf, I found another 2 rounds of shotgun ammo, which turned out to be scattered all throughout the recreation base. I quickly moved on to the fifth room, which had a deck that let me safely get past a decent length of hallway. Now in front of me were the stairs, which I assumed would lead to the classified equipment I needed. At the bottom of the steps, I was met with 2 paths. The right looked easier to navigate than the chaos on the left, so I went right. In panic, I missed both my shots toward a Scout Mimic in the first room. Luckily in the beta, you get a telepathic freeze ability you can only use on accident, and I triggered it here. If mimics can walk through walls in the beta, I guess this balances out the cosmic scales. Anyway, I moved on to the last room down the hallway and took out a waiting mimic. This led to a room full of showers where I found a stashed MP9, my first 9x19 firearm. The shower room exited into a pool area where I found the portal to get out and could clearly hear beeping from the briefcase. I searched around for a while but couldn't find it, leaving the other side of the recreation base as the most likely spot. I slowly made my way past the stairs into a mess of items which disguised a cleverly hidden Stormtrooper Mimic. On my next attempt, I had an unfortunate encounter with a Stormtrooper Mimic again, then another Stormtrooper Mimic, and lastly, another Stormtrooper Mimic in a new spot. I eventually made it past the Room of Chaos where I found the briefcase and a stashed AK-74. I grabbed one in each hand, and with voice lines coming from the left and right, I moved cautiously. I didn't encounter any more enemies on the short walk to the portal. I sprinted back to the facility, taking the exact route as earlier. About 15 seconds from the facility, I was ambushed by 2 Scout Mimics. I tried taking a slightly different route the next time and died even faster. On attempt number 3, with less than 5 hours before the tide I might add, I broke through with a bit of patient sneaking and a couple shotgun ammo. Before entering the facility, I put down my stashed AK-74 to press the location on the map, and should have said goodbye while I had the chance. I went back for the gun once I delivered the briefcase, but it somehow glitched out of existence. The only reasonable conclusion was that the Mimic skill trees were growing. What next? Were they going to start flying and shooting balls of energy at me? Anyway, I then organized my hordes of new loot, completed a couple generic item searches, and got prepared for my first mission into the deadly Prochorsk outskirts. After sleeping past the tide, I made my way along the winding left path in the forest to the heavily defended North Bridge. There's a portal to cross the river easily further north, which I wasn't allowed to use, so I slowly had to pick off a large group of mimics with my basic pistol. After definitely not dying even one time, I killed a few police mimics and a spawn, then picked off the 2 mimics sniping from higher ground. The final distance to the outskirts had easier enemies to get past, though I almost got tapped by a Scout Mimic when exiting the forest. On entering the outskirts, I was given the 3 potential locations for a distortion-proof prototype. I took out a Scout Mimic in the distance before entering the tall reeds, which drew out the first exploding fragment. The interaction would have been a lot cleaner if my GSH-18 wasn't jamming every other shot, but I didn't want to switch to my slightly worse pistol. pistol. Once I was confident there weren't many enemies left in the area, I made my way through the maze of interconnected paths to check the first potential location. Found the bright distortion-proof mask in plain sight on a table. One of the mimics must have placed it there nicely with all their free time. Next, I started moving toward the last part of the mission, which was collecting a sample container on the opposite side of the reeds. The pathing in the swamp guided me into a somewhat open area, with high potential for mimics to jump out at any second and send me to the grave. I noticed a hunter mimic and took action, though it may have been smart to try avoiding combat altogether. My GSH-18 was jamming as much as ever, and my ability to die by shooting reflector anomalies was at its all-time peak as well. On attempt number 2, I tried the same thing again, with the addition of running back to a defendable position faster. It didn't work, but at least I knew now where the scout mimic was approximately located. On attempt 3, I found some higher ground to search for the aforementioned scout mimic, and used my stashed SKS to reduce my chance of error. I then defeated a police mimic, spawn, and a couple of fragments, eventually retreating all the way back to my initial entrance in the reeds. I also had this wonderful interaction, where I finally had the chance to use the reflector anomaly to my own advantage. During my final stretch to locating the sample container, I managed to avoid any enemy encounters, besides being spotted by the red cube. Spent a few minutes inside this distortion zone. The high amount of anomalies, confusing pathing, and limited vision inside the distortion zone made the mission a little tedious, though eventually I made it out of the distortion zone and the outskirts alive. On returning to the forest, I expected the one scout mimic from before, but I was met with a couple spawns and an extra scout mimic as well. Since it was night and I had terrible equipment, ended up dying multiple times. I eventually realized I needed to run as fast as I could from the start, without giving the scout mimics any time to move closer. I made it back to the facility and received my reward. I didn't throw away the distortion mask I earned in case it'd be essential in a future part of the run, but I managed to never use it. I also received my 7th top priority mission, simply labeled Artifact Delivery for now. The mission took place much deeper into the Pechorsk outskirts and is the final top mission in 0.14. With a day and 12 hours left before the tide, I opted to finish an equipment maintenance mission instead. While doing said mission, I ended up finding another stashed SKS and a bunch more loot. I promptly sold the stashed SKS and a majority of my valuables, bought a third sidearm holster from my stashed MP9, got my stashed SKS ready for the journey, and went through the effort of filling up every last bit of space with my most useful items. I then slept and used a strategy I call tide rotation, which means sleeping past a couple tides to get past the cycle with the most daylight. Back in the forest, all the enemies had respawned, which made me grateful for extremely convenient interactions like this one. At the North Bridge, I took out 2 police mimics in about a minute, but I used up a lot of ammo and healing syringes. I made a quick trip back to the facility where I healed up, refilled my ammo and magazines, and cleaned my pistol. A hunter and spawn were waiting for me, and a scout mimic I couldn't find was damaging me as fast as I could heal. Knowing I was about to die, I restarted to the beginning of the forest with plans of being more defensive. This time I was able to take out the hunter while I was approaching. Unfortunately, the 2 scout mimics were too much to handle without good cover and proper protection, so I died. On attempt number 4, a scout mimic from near the floating house took me out while I was casually confirming my equipment wasn't in order, and on attempt number 7, I snuck as far left as I could when passing the floating house to hopefully not alert the mimics there. I hadn't alerted them the first few times I passed that area, so I figured this would probably work. It definitely didn't turn out as I expected, much better in fact. I managed to take out both scout mimics without dying and landed a few much needed headshots, which guaranteed a critical hit. Fortunately, while dealing with the floating house mimics, I didn't alert the enemies near the bridge, and I was able to find a good position to take out the hunter as it was approaching. For whatever reason, the scout mimics took a bit longer to start moving toward me, and I was able to tactically cut off their route into the trees. This time I took out both scout mimics with little issue. Since there didn't seem to be many enemies left besides the one in the tower, I snuck past that area and entered the Pechorsk outskirts. This time my mission in the outskirts took me far along the left side of the map, and with night approaching quickly, I moved as fast as I could. My first enemy encounter was in an anomaly cluster, where I managed to avoid taking any damage. I took a right since I knew the bridge up ahead was enveloped in a distortion zone, which would be almost impossible to get through without using the mask. Unfortunately, the path I chose took me near the red cube, which noticed me and started following. I was close to the underground apartment I needed to enter, and luckily didn't encounter any more enemies while the cube was following. I found my way inside the underground apartment and took a moment to collect myself and make a plan of action. I knew the sensor was likely at the bottom, so I figured I'd go down without taking any unnecessary time to loot, which would mean fewer enemies to deal with. I ended up finding the sensor and portal without a single interaction with an enemy, and I took damage only once from a reflector anomaly. The portal took me right outside the underground apartment, and I took a quick look at my map to see where the next sensor was. Thankfully, the red cube had reset to its normal scouting route, and I hid in its blind spot while moving toward the middle right side of the map. It was starting to get dark, and as the red cube moved past me, I clutched my SKS and made a mad dash to the next sensor. The red cube still hadn't noticed me, but halfway there I was spotted by 2 recovering fragments and 2 mimics. I killed the recovering fragments easily with my SKS, and also took out one of the scout mimics that was on me. I tried killing the second mimic, but I ended up rushing the next sensor instead of potentially drawing out more enemies. I got to the 3rd sensor alive, which of course wasn't the last one. While eating and healing, I forgot to keep track of where the red cube was, and it spotted me as I started moving to the 4th sensor. Strategically, I slowed my pace to save stamina for dodging its projectiles, though it didn't shoot until I reached the last sensor. Next, I booked it to a shelter nearby to prepare and let the red cube de-aggro. I made sure to heal up to max health, eat, and even cleaned up my pistol and SKS to avoid any jamming or misfiring. Looking at the mission, it seemed like all I had left was to grab one artifact near the center of the red cube's path. I hoped dearly that I wouldn't need to use my advanced artifact detector here and void my security level 0 run. Once I exited the shelter, I carefully moved along the outside of the map and took out an exploding fragment. I went back to the shelter to refill my ammo and get protection from other enemies I alerted in the area. While inside, I was getting a bunch of mimic voice lines and even got one while I was moving toward the artifact. But instead of getting into a drawn-out battle at night, I sprinted toward my objective. The artifact was in a tricky spot, and after grabbing it, I checked to make sure the mission was complete. Next, I waited till the red cube had almost passed, and moved toward the bridge to the left side of the map. I clutched my SKS with 2 hands nearly the whole way back, ready to spend every last ounce of ammo I had to send anything that moved to the grave or sky or whatever. When I returned to the forest, there weren't many enemies waiting for me like earlier, and I got past the scout mimic in the tower I'd left alive. I dropped off the artifact, threw out the 2 syringes I received for good measure, and double-checked there weren't any more top priority missions left. I celebrated, healed up, organized my stuff, and took a good last long look at my organized shelves. After 18 cruel real-world hours, I'd finally done it. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more Into the Radius 2 stuff, feel free to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next one.